Virgin Most Powerful Radio, sharing the gospel with clarity and charity.
And now, Virgin Most Powerful Radio is pleased to present Hands-On Apologetics with renowned Catholic author and apologist, Gary Michuta.
Welcome, everybody. Hands-On Apologetics. You have entered into Virgin Most Powerful's Apologetic Dojo. Gary Michuta, and welcome. It's great to be with you to talk about how to explain, defend the faith, and charity and clarity, and give us more reasons to know and love Jesus. And my favorite time of the day, I hope it's your favorite as well. And coming on the show, well, first I should say, I hope everybody has a happy and blessed Ascension Thursday. In fact, we'll probably talk a little bit about Ascension Thursday if we have some time. But instead, we're going to continue our series that we've been doing here on books that every Catholic apologist, every defender of faith ought to have on their bookshelves. And to help us work through some of the classics that I think needs to be kept alive, you know, that it's just great stuff in print. We're going to have Master Apologist Karl Keating, the guy who started the modern Catholic apologetics movement here in the United States. He's going to be joining us after the break, and we're going to talk about a particular historian that I think everybody should know. And like I said, if you defend the faith, he's a great resource to have. I'm not going to tell you who it is. I will tell you after the break. So there's your cliffhanger, folks. Keep you listening. So we're going to have lots of fun when Karl comes into the dojo today. Also, we're going to sharpen our critical thinking skills, and the Finding the Fallacy of today is the non sequitur fallacy. And we also meet one of the early church fathers, and today's early church father is a famous one, St. Gregory of Nyssa. So lots in store for you today and this wonderful Thursday, and I know that for me, it's going to be a lot of fun, and God willing, it would be fun for you as well. And you are a part of the program. So please, if you want to give Karl Keating a question or a comment or share something with him, give us a call at the other side of the break at 888-526-2151. That's 888-526-2151. Or you can always email your questions at handsonapologetics.com. Boy, I'm stumbling over my words. That's questions at handsonapologetics, all one word, .com. Love to hear from you. We've had some great emails over the past. In fact, some of them actually made it on the show. Not everyone, but we definitely have certain ones that I think are very insightful. And so please keep it coming. Love to hear from you. And it's time for our shout-outs. Welcome, everybody watching live stream on Facebook and YouTube. Hello. We have a sad face from the Byzantine Catholic for Life. Well, I'm sorry. Yeah. Well, we're going through the early church fathers. You know, we got to do this in order. Got to have them all in. And thank you, Beth, for the explosion of emojis. And by the way, if you're wondering what I'm talking about, you can watch the program. In fact, all the programs here on Virgin Most Powerful Radio live on Facebook and YouTube. And also, you can listen to us on iHeartRadio and all sorts of wonderful things. So, good stuff all around. Hey, Jose. Hey, Ricky. Good to see you. And it's good for you to come and chat with us, listening over the radio. So, without further ado, why don't we jump into the Finding the Fallacy for today? Finding the Fallacy is the non sequitur. Of course, that's Latin for does not follow. The does not follow fallacy. Now, I bet you can guess from that name exactly what this fallacy entails, and you guessed it correctly. It does not. It's when someone argues a point where the conclusion doesn't follow from the premises, and that is the non sequitur fallacy. You'll get all sorts of non sequiturs, including maybe some that I will give on this program occasionally. It's when you follow the premises, you have to say, okay, does this prove that the conclusion must be true? For example, someone could say, there are lots of bad Catholics, therefore Jesus didn't establish the church. That's a great non sequitur. Why? Because, well, does the presence of bad Catholics prove that Jesus did or did not establish the Catholic Church? Well, no, the two are disconnected. One does not follow from the other. And you could have all sorts of non sequiturs. In fact, this is probably one of the most common fallacies out there. And it's simply due, I think, to inattention, that people don't really carefully look at how they argue things. And so they just they propose arguments that are sort of like the conclusion, but it doesn't necessarily follow that the conclusion follows. So that is our finding of the fallacy for today, the non sequitur. And let's go to the Meet the Early Church Father segment, shall we? And the early church father today is St. Gregory of Nyssa, who is one of the three great Cappadocian fathers. So keep that in mind. If you're new to this whole idea of early church writings, the Cappadocian fathers, there are three, and which is Basil the Great, Gregory of Nazianzus, and Gregory of Nyssa. So whenever somebody mentions the Cappadocian fathers, chances are it'll be those three. Okay, just FYI. Well, today's early church father, St. Gregory of Nyssa, is one of those three greats, if you will. Gregory of Nyssa is the younger brother of Basil of Caesarea. He was born in the year 335, and he's the third of the three Cappadocians. Unlike Basil, though, he was not a very good administrator or a leader. And unlike Gregory of Nazianzus, the other two early church Cappadocian fathers, he was not a particularly attractive preacher. So why is St. Gregory of Nyssa included among these three greats? Well, because he had extraordinary gift as a mystic, a theologian, and a writer. In fact, his sheer versatility in his writing far surpasses the other two. So I guess you could say that he would be kind of the theologian of the three, where Basil would be the administrator leader, and Gregory of Nazianzus would be the preacher. Gregory was educated, for the most part, by his older brother Basil. After having advanced in the church as far as lector, he decided on a worldly career as a teacher of rhetoric, and he was married. The other Gregory convinced him to retire to Basil's monastery, and in the autumn of 371, Basil, trying to consolidate his ecclesiastical authority as metropolitan, consecrated Gregory as bishop of Nyssa, just as he was sending the other Gregory to Sasima. Now, Gregory of Nyssa, like Gregory of Nazianzus, was consecrated rather much against their preferences, if not literally against their will. Gregory of Nyssa, however, at least agreed to take possession of his see, but other than that, he was disappointed his brother, not just as much as the other Gregory. Basil criticized him, blamed him rather constantly for his lack of firmness, his political, ecclesiastical unfitness, and his poor fiscal administration. So, he didn't want the job, and he wasn't very well suited at the job. Gregory had furthermore to contend with a considerable opposition of the Arians, who had falsely accused them of misappropriating funds, and in the Synod of Nyssa in 376 deposed them in absentia. But when the Emperor Valens died 2 years later, Gregory was able to return to Nyssa, and in 379, the Synod of Antioch made him visitator in the Pontius, and while he was on mission in 380, he was elected bishop of Sebastia. In 381, at Constantinople, he was an outspoken defendant of Gregory of Nazianzus, and we find him again in Constantinople to preach at the funeral of Princess Puchula in 385, and shortly afterwards he did the same for his mother. He was present at the synod convened in Constantinople in 394, and basically from that point on, he kind of falls off the pages of history. So I think Jurgens description of Gregory of Nyssa is quite apt. He was a very good theologian, a mystic, very good writer, but he wasn't a good preacher, nor was he good at administration, like the other two Cappadocian fathers. So that's our Meet the Early Church Father for today, St. Gregory of Nyssa, and who lived from AD 335 to 394. So good stuff, folks. You know, it's important in apologetics that we have a good grasp of the early church, and especially those who are known as the early church fathers who have left us writings in the earliest centuries of the church. Why? Well, because they witnessed to the faith at its earliest stages, if you will. So I know that's kind of a tripping point for many non-Catholics, because when they look at the early church fathers, they say, well, these people don't have any authority. I mean, they're not important. They have just as much to our opinions as my pastor. Well, in fact, the early church fathers, we're not citing them because of their particular authority. Really what we're doing is we're citing them because they are witnesses to the pristine Catholic faith at the very beginning. And so all the early church fathers, from the apostolic fathers all the way through the Cappadocians, all the way to the last one, St. John Damascene, all of which give us a picture of the faith of the first centuries of the church. So there you have it. So we're done with our exercises for today. And like I said, coming up on the other side of break, we might talk a little bit about Ascension Thursday, and also have Master Apologist Karl Keating, the founder and one-time director of Catholic Answers, will be coming into the dojo and talk about a particular historian whose books every Catholic apologist ought to have on their bookshelf. Stay tuned, everybody. We'll be right back.
This is Terry Barber inviting you, all the men, to a men's conference June 15th at the Sacred Heart Chapel. This is going to be a day where we're going to talk about true masculinity. You know, there's a problem in the Catholic Church today. We have very few men who love the Catholic faith. And I know a lot of the wives that I'm listening to right now saying, I want my husband to be on fire for the faith. Send him to the men's conference. Your son, send him to the men's conference by going to virginmostpowerfulradio.org or call 877-526-2151. That's June 15th. When your husband comes back from this conference, or your son, they're going to have a different view about their Catholic faith, because they're going to meet three men who love Jesus and his bride, the church, and are going to instill in them a love for Christ and his church, the Eucharist, Our Lady. Bring them to virginmostpowerfulradio.org. Sign up there or call 877-526-2151. Full sheen ahead.
It is only because of your continued prayers and generous donations that Virgin Most Powerful Radio can broadcast live each weekday. We count on your spiritual and financial support because you understand the urgent need for Catholic programming that shares the gospel with clarity and charity, but without compromise. Please prayerfully consider becoming a monthly donor. You can set it up with the touch of a button on our website, catholicrc.org.
Buying or selling your home or your business property? This is Terry Barber. Real Estate for Life underwrites the Terry and Jesse Show, and they can connect you to one of 900 pro-life real estate agents around the world. And when they receive their referral fee, they will give 80% of it to a pro-life organization. Wow, that's 80%. realestateforlife.org, 877-LIFE-US1.
Now, back to Hands-on Apologetics with Gary Machuda. If you'd like to join the conversation, call 888-526-2151. Here's Gary.
And welcome back, everybody. Hands-on Apologetics. Well, Which books should us Catholics who are on fire for the faith, we want to defend the faith, what books should we have on our bookshelves? Well, to help us know some of the classics that unfortunately have kind of fallen by the wayside, and that nevertheless are gold in terms of information about the faith. We have Master Apologist Karl Keating coming into the dojo. Karl was a prime mover for me to get into apologetics, and I believe history will put him down as the beginning of the modern Catholic apologetics movement in the United States. He's the founder of Catholic Answers, and now he's full-time author. He's written somewhere around perhaps even more than 16 books. The most important one that for me was Catholicism and Fundamentalism, but he's written some outstanding works such as Debating Catholicism series, Book for Life, No Apologies. And by the way, if you go on the Virgin Most Powerful Radio website, you can see some interviews that we've done with Karl on some of his books. Karl also is an incredibly talented writer, not only writing on religious topics, but also on literature, outdoors, on self-publishing, and even fiction. So, Karl Keating, welcome to Hands On Apologetics.
Gary, it's great to be back with you, and we have a chance today to talk again about a particularly favorite author of ours, a different one from before, but this is somebody that both you and I have read a lot about and admired for a long time.
Yes, and that is none other than Hilaire Belloc. I was kind of using that as a cliffhanger earlier in this show. So that's, yes, history is so important for apologetics because there's so much mythological, no popery history out there. And so we need really great resources in this area. So who exactly is Hilaire Belloc?
Well, Belloc, to many people, is best known as a great friend of G.K. Chesterton. They were more or less contemporaries. Belloc was born in 1870, died in 1953. So he was born before and died after Chesterton. He was the author of about 100 books. And he was one of those writers who almost literally had to write to eat. My great friend, Dr. Stedman Johnson from the 18th century, was in a similar position. He literally had to write to eat. And so Belloc wrote on a wide swath of topics, most of them religiously oriented, but he was historian of an amateur sort, armchair historian, but more than that, he'd go out and actually, for example, tramp through the battlefields of history to get a better sense of what really happened so he could explain better to his public. He was a journalist. He wrote for various publications in London and elsewhere. He was a great walker and a sailor. And
I didn't know that.
The walking is what we're going to be getting to today in this book. And for me, Gary, this is particularly apt because I have just a few days ago come back from more than 2 weeks' walk on a pilgrimage route in Italy, the Camino di San Benedetto. And I might have covered ground that was not the same ground that Belloc did, but in parallel, at least in part. So I'm very much looking forward to our talking about his most famous book, his earliest book, the one that brought him the most money, and that in many ways shaped his notoriety, and that's The Path to Rome.
Right. Yeah, very good. Do you know how he got into writing? Like you said, he's pretty famous for saying, he writes to eat. But did he write articles or something and then eventually make it into books? Or did he just jump into writing?
I'm not recollecting now. I have in front of me A.N. Wilson's 1984 biography of Belloc, which is sort of the standard work. I haven't looked at it for quite some time, so I'm not remembering exactly when Belloc began to write. He wrote privately as an adolescent early on, but for publication, I'm not exactly sure, but it must have been, of course, before The Path to Rome came out. That was about a walk he took in 1901. The book came out in 1902. Mm-hmm. And it was very popular, and it still remains popular, still in print. But what he wrote before that, of more ephemeral stuff, I don't now have a recollection.
Okay. Yeah, I was just curious because, Path of Rome definitely it stands at the top of his list of writings. So tell us a little bit about this book.
Well, Belloc, although he was an Englishman, he served in the French army. And he was posted chiefly in a small town in the northeast segment of France called Toul, Toul. It's almost directly south of Luxembourg and directly west of Strasbourg. Okay. So Belloc's intention in this book was to walk from Toul through Switzerland all the way through the upper half of Italy to Rome, and to do it in a month. And he made 2 vows as part of his walk, which was in some way a penitential walk, I suppose you could say. He vowed to take no wheeled conveyance, and he vowed to hear Mass every day. And he was pretty much able to accomplish that, not completely, but close. He did make it to Rome, and he wrote this book, which is it's hard to explain really what it is. But let me give A.N. Wilson's explanation. He says, if there's one prose work by which Belloc is remembered, it is The Path to Rome. It was undertaken in defiance of common sense. It's a work of pure self-indulgence and caprice. Rambling, elegant, mannered, and chatty, it was by far the most successful book in financial terms that he ever wrote. Its scheme is very bold. It tells the story of a journey on foot in less than a month. And this is, by the way, over about 750 miles in a month. So that's 25 miles a day. From Toul, where he did military service, along the Moselle River, over the Alps, down through Tuscany to the Holy City itself. But it's not a travel book. And Wilson goes on to explain that Belloc writes about places that hit his fancies. So, for example, he devotes 10 pages in the book to a very small town of Flavigny in France. And it's Roman remains, it's agriculture, and so on. But he rushes through Tuscany and has almost nothing to say about those many towns and places there that Americans might be familiar with from travel shows or actually their own visits. Right. But that's Belloc's way. It's sort of scattershot, but it's a delightful scattershot. So The Path to Rome, Wilson says, is very far from being an autobiography. And after all, Belloc was of the opinion, he said, no gentleman writes about his private life. And so it's not really about an autobiography, but it is a self-portrait. And it's a celebration of the kind of guy that Belloc was. So it's a picture of him on the march, sometimes literally. And it's a book that made his reputation. Wilson goes on to say, it presented a full square caricature of its author to the world, an opinionated super tramp, happy so long as there's Mass at the beginning of the day and wine and good Catholic cheer at the end of it. But the character does not, in Belloc's case, distort the truth, because this is really what he was. So in Belloc's case, the caricature was actually the man, too. So this wild Catholic vagabond who's walking 750 miles in a month, that's the guy. That's how he was. And that's pretty much how he was throughout the remainder of his long life.
So it's kind of a story. It's kind of a diary. It's kind of a travel log. It's got all sorts of different features together.
Yeah, one of the curious things is that he often has the reader engage in dialogue with himself. So he'll have a point where he'll interject what the reader, whoever the reader might be, is in conversation with him. So he's got lector and auctor. So he's the lector is the reader, and so for example, at one point he has lector saying, "Pray dwell less on your religion," and then Belloc interrupts him as the auctor. He said, "Pray take books as you find them and treat travel as travel." So he's sort of anticipating what an average reader, or maybe not so average reader, might be thinking as the reader's going through the book, And so he actually interjects the reader's comments and then answers them as a kind of aside. He does that all through the book. And at other points, he's got he draws maps and illustrations of where he's going. At one point, which having come just back from a long pilgrimage hike myself through very stormy weather, and where I found myself wondering, why did I bring myself out here? Belloc at one of the pages draws a little line, sort of, what do you call it? Maybe an altitude representation, elevation representation of going from point A to point B. And he says, it feels like this. And it's so, far up, then down, then a little straight line, then up and down to represent the hills. He says, in actuality, it's like this, and it's almost completely flat, But when you're in bad weather and on a rocky, muddy trail, and you're cold and you're wet, and you have to go up a rise of only 100 feet, it seems like it goes up forever.
Yeah.
And so he sort of takes joy in representing those kinds of things in his book. So he's got dozens of illustrations of where he is. Sometimes they're line drawings of buildings or ruins or whatever. He also has lots of maps, sort of topographic style maps that will show elevations and drop-offs and so on. And he might draw a picture of an interesting rock or a bit of a valley or a house or what have you. And it all goes along with his story. And it's just the edition I have is well over 400 pages long. And it concludes actually with a song he wrote. It gives the sheet music, So it's a delightful book, and he's often quoting conversations he has with people, and he'll take an aside and go into British history, or French history, or Italian history, and he'll give it a little something. So it's not at all in any way a normal travel book. If you were to take the path to Rome, you probably could not, from it, reproduce his actual path because he skips big parts. Suddenly he's 50 miles ahead, and you're not sure how he got there. So it's not that kind of book. It's not, on my book on the Camino di San Benedetto these last few weeks, I had to find guidebooks. So I knew, go this way, turn there, take this shortcut, whatever. And so that was very straightforward. He had nothing like that, and he didn't write anything like that. There are enough times when he says, for example,
I hear the music. I want to talk to you about your experience and how it ties in. We're talking with master apologist Karl Keating about Hilaire Belloc. Stay tuned, everybody.
This is Terry Barber inviting you, all the men, to a men's conference June 15th at the Sacred Heart Chapel. This is going to be a day where we're going to talk about true masculinity. There's a problem in the Catholic Church today. We have very few men who love the Catholic faith. And I know a lot of the wives that I'm listening to right now saying, I want my husband to be on fire for the faith. Send him to the men's conference. Your son, send him to the men's conference by going to virginmostpowerfulradio.org or call 877-526-2151. That's June 15th. When your husband comes back from this conference or your son, they're going to have a different view about their Catholic faith because they're going to meet three men who love Jesus and his bride, the church, and are going to instill in them a love for Christ and his church, the Eucharist, Our Lady. Bring them to virginmostpowerfulradio.org. Sign up there or call 877-526-2151. Full sheen ahead.
It is only because of your continued prayers and generous donations that Virgin Most Powerful Radio can broadcast live each weekday. We count on your spiritual and financial support because you understand the urgent need for Catholic programming that shares the gospel with clarity and charity, but without compromise. Please prayerfully consider becoming a monthly donor. You can set it up with the touch of a button on our website, catholicrc.org.
Buying or selling your home or your business property? This is Terry Barber. Real Estate for Life underwrites the Terry and Jesse Show, and they can connect you to one of 900 pro-life real estate agents around the world. And when they receive their referral fee, they will give 80% of it to a pro-life organization. Wow, that's 80%. realestateforlife.org, 877-LIFE-US1.
This is Jesse Romero. You're listening to Hands-On Apologetics with Gary Machuda on Virgin Most Powerful Radio.
And welcome back, everybody. We're chatting with Master Apologist Karl Keating about a very important author that I think every Catholic apologist ought to have at least some of his works on the shelf, and that is Hilaire Belloc. And we're discussing first his most popular work, Path to Rome. And Karl, right before we came up to the break, you were making some comparisons between your own trek through Italy and Path Through Rome.
Yeah, I've just gotten back from a nearly 3-week trip to Italy where I walked almost all of the Camino di San Benedetto. That's the Way of St. Benedict. It's a newish pilgrimage route set out about 10 years ago. And it runs from Norcia in Umbria. Norcia is the town where Benedict was born. And it goes through Subiaco at sort of the midpoint. That's where he spent most of his life and built about 13 monasteries. And it ends at Monte Cassino, where he died. And so I had several reasons to go on the route. One of them is that I'm going to be writing a book about the journey, and it will be actually the first book by somebody who's been on that route. And I'm hoping that, as a consequence, many Americans will be induced to see the part of Italy that Benedict, a millennium and a half ago, would have seen, but of course in a somewhat different way.
Right.
So I was there, and I unfortunately I had selected May as a month that I thought would be balmy, not too hot yet, because being from the desert, I don't like to get into the humidity of Europe during its summer. And it turned out that this May was the wettest and coldest in decades in Italy.
Yeah.
So I was walking through monsoon rains and up and down trails that were muddy and
wow.
over and around horse droppings and cow pies that had become cow meringue pies. And
wow.
it was an interesting and often frustrating walk, but it turned out, because of our discussion today, to be, I think, most appropriate to sort of get my mind going about what the walk must have been for Belloc when he went from the small town Toul in France to Rome in a month. There's one point in there where in the book he's talking about one of his objects, which is to get to Mass every day. And the comment that he makes, let me see if I can find it here. I probably am missing it. But he says that he appreciates having gotten to a Mass, and it's a short, low Mass. And remember, this is in the day still of the Latin Mass, with two forms, the High Mass, which would be sung or chanted, and the more common Low Mass, which is the standard one you'd find in parishes. And so Belloc was a man of artistic sensibilities, but still one that was sort of businesslike in ways. So he wanted to get to Mass in the morning. He wanted it nice and short, in and out, and back on his way. So he made that kind of comment. And, so as I'm thinking back now on the walk that I just took, and the much longer walk by close to 6 times that Belloc took, I have to say that I have to marvel at the fact that he averaged 25 miles a day over considerable up and down terrain.
Yeah.
I was not able to hit, that speed myself ever. So, but of course, I have an excuse. He was less, at that time in 1901, he was less than half my present age.
Yeah,
so
right. That's true.
I can take some solace in that.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about the comparison of distance covered, because he seems to have been a pretty stout individual to be able to make that much distance in such a short time.
Yeah, well, he was a beefy man, very strong. He wasn't fat in the sense of having a lot until later in life, having a lot of excess, adipose tissue. But when he was young, he was really quite athletic, although he didn't participate in sports in the normal sense of things.
Mm-hmm.
His wife, actually, Elodie, was an American from Napa, California. And when he came to the United States to court her, he walked a good part of the distance across the country. He took trains, too. But he did a lot of walking. And so he, could get, I can understand, to the point easily enough of doing 25 miles a day without great exertion. But still, when you think about that, that's substantial. And, and he was traveling at a time where the roads, to the extent there were roads, were dirt. And if it rained, it was mud, so on and so forth. And the equipment that he carried, what little he had, clothing and so on, was heavyweight by our standards, wool and whatnot. He would walk with, a bottle of wine, some cheese, some bread. That's what he carried every day. And he'd hope to stop in some village where he could find some place to eat, not usually a restaurant because there wouldn't be any, but in some house that he could make arrangements. So it was very much of a vagabond journey, and in its own way, I think, a rather courageous one. But more importantly for us, looking back at the path to Rome, it shows a real delight in existence, in the faith, in Europe as it still was then, which was largely Catholic. I mean, he was able to go through small towns in France and Italy, and every day, basically, find a Mass in the morning. Yeah. I've just gone through more than 2 weeks of hiking through towns, and which would be of comparable size. I mean, it's mostly very small. There are churches, but nobody's there. There are no priests there. The two Sunday Masses I went to, for example, were celebrated by non-Italian priests. It's much different now than it was. I mean, the faith is not everywhere the way it was in Belloc's time. Yeah. What I saw were memories of the faith. I would come across these little wayside shrines that he writes about very eloquently in The Path to Rome. But when he writes about them, there's still a lively local, lively local exemplars of the faith in the population. And now that's not the case. I talked with somebody who helped to set up the community San Benedetto, and he told me that about 80% of the people who hike it are not religious at all. They don't go for religious purposes. So in Belloc's time, of course, there wasn't the popularity of doing pilgrimages the way there is now. For example, the Camino de Santiago in Spain. But those who did them, like Belloc, it was chiefly for religious purposes. And wherever he went, he found religious people. And so there was still that, at least, in the countryside, because that's where he was walking. If you got to the big cities, Paris and Rome, of course, you'd have a much smaller percentage of believers and practicers, even then. But today, it's quite a different situation. So the walk may be easier today, but the ambiance is quite different from what Belloc had 120 years ago.
Yeah, especially since it's before the Great War. I mean, it's kind of a snapshot of Europe before, the destruction of the two great wars.
That's a good point, yes, because World War I was really the civilization-destroying war of the 20th century. Right. World War II may have killed more people, but the destruction, it really, as recently deceased Catholic historian John Lukács often noted, World War I was the bigger disaster because it actually destroyed European civilization. Mm-hmm. And and then, of course, made possible the Second War. Yeah. But Belloc was walking a dozen years before that, and he still had a lively Christian ethos wherever he went. And that comes out. It comes out beautifully because he was such a Christian man himself. It was Belloc who could write, perhaps not entirely accurately, but pretty much so, the faith is Europe and Europe is the faith, which is to say that Europe was constructed because of the Catholic faith. And it wouldn't be what it is if not for the Catholic faith. And even in his time, it was still somewhat true to say Europe is the faith because although, of course, the faith had come to the Americas and some other places, the preponderance of Catholics in the world were still in Europe. Now it's quite different, of course. But there was that ambiance of Catholicism was really everywhere, especially in the rural areas, something that simply doesn't exist now. So there's a kind of wistfulness when we read The Path to Rome today. We can see what it was in our grandparents' or great-grandparents' youth. Okay, that's the kind of Europe that still existed, and it's gone. The monuments may still be there, but the meaning of the monuments has often been emptied in the hearts of the people who live around them.
Yeah, that's it's sad. But you made a really good point because that love of Europe and love of Catholicism that Belloc had really bore fruit from later on in other books, where especially love of Europe, and like he said, how he equates Catholicism, Christianity with civilization in Europe and the consequences of the great conflicts and so on.
He was really quite prescient. In the 1930s, for example, he wrote a book about the future revival of Islam. And back in those days, nobody was thinking that.
Yeah.
Nobody. And yet he wrote about that as a likely consequence in the not-too-distant future. So he might have been 50 years early on it, but he's basically right.
Yeah.
He wrote a lot of history books, a lot of biographies of one of the books, also fairly well known, still in print, Characters of the Reformation, of the English Reformation. And he had a lot of knowledge about people and places. As I alluded to earlier, one of the nice things about him is that when he would write history, he'd go out to the historical sites and walk the fields to get a sense of what really happened. So he was not really an armchair historian. On the other hand, he was not an academic historian. One of the things he's always faulted for is that he never includes footnotes.
Yeah.
And he's, but his knowledge of what happens of human instincts and motives, very profound.
Yeah, very good. Well, we were chatting with master apologist Karl Keating about the great writer Hilaire Belloc. Some of his work should be on your bookshelf. On the other side of the break, we're going to talk more about Belloc. Stay tuned.
This is Terry Barber inviting you, all the men, to a men's conference June 15th at the Sacred Heart Chapel. This is going to be a day where we're going to talk about true masculinity. There's a problem in the Catholic Church today. We have very few men who love the Catholic faith. And I know a lot of the wives that I'm listening to right now saying, I want my husband to be on fire for the faith. Send him to the men's conference. Your son, send him to the men's conference by going to virginmostpowerfulradio.org or call 877-526-2151. That's June 15th. When your husband comes back from this conference or your son, they're going to have a different view about their Catholic faith because they're going to meet three men who love Jesus and his bride, the church, and are going to instill in them a love for Christ and his church, the Eucharist, Our Lady. Bring them to virginmostpowerfulradio.org. Sign up there or call 877-526-2151. Full sheen ahead.
It is only because of your continued prayers and generous donations that Virgin Most Powerful Radio can broadcast live each weekday. We count on your spiritual and financial support because you understand the urgent need for Catholic programming that shares the gospel with clarity and charity, but without compromise. please prayerfully consider becoming a monthly donor. You can set it up with the touch of a button on our website, catholicrc.org.
Buying or selling your home or your business property? This is Terry Barber. Real Estate for Life underwrites the Terry and Jesse Show. And they can connect you to one of 900 pro-life real estate agents around the world. And when they receive their referral fee, they will give 80% of it to a pro-life organization. Wow! That's 80%! realestateforlife.org, 877-LIFE-US1.
Now, back to Hands-On Apologetics with Gary Machuda. If you'd like to join the conversation, call 888-526-2151. Here's Gary.
And welcome back, everybody. We are chatting with Master Apologist Karl Keating about Hilaire Belloc. And actually, we already started talking a little bit about some of his other books, Karl. But if I could just pause right there, because I'm dying to ask you this question that is maybe not related to Belloc, but you mentioned that you finished in Monte Cassino. And I know from all my World War II documentaries how remote that was. How was it getting up to Monte Cassino?
Well, Monte Cassino, I think, is counted as the world's largest abbey. Mm-hmm. It's probably known to most Americans for having been destroyed by an Allied bombardment in 1944. The German army was ensconced up on the hill where the abbey is. And it was in the 1950s, the abbey was meticulously rebuilt according to just what it was before. And it's got the remains of St. Benedict and his twin sister Scholastica. It's a large complex, very few monks there, unfortunately. So it's, to me, rather cold-feeling place. Mm-hmm. As I was walking, actually, the things that struck me most were some small wayside chapels, things that I never would have come across. There was one point outside of a town called Trevi nel Lazio, that is Trevi in the province of Lazio, to distinguish it from the better-known town of Trevi, as in Trevi Fountain kind of town. But there's a path that goes on forever into the woods, and it comes to a little rise, a little saddle between two taller peaks. And there in the middle of the forest is an ancient Roman arch just by itself. And that happened to be at a point of demarcation between two Roman provinces. And that's where you'd pay a tax going across this saddle. And it just struck me as, on the one hand, a glorious thing to have been preserved for more than 2,000 years. Yeah. But also a very sad thing to find. I mean, you have to hike for hours to get to it. It's by itself. There's nothing around it, no other structure. And I'm not even sure why it was built there, because you could have just had a fence or a line in the dirt and had your tax collector sit there and get the toll. Yeah. But anyway, the Romans built this beautiful arch, and it sits forlornly, and it has for centuries. But to me, it sort of represented the arbitrariness, in a way, of what was done. I mean, why build an arch there in the forest? It's not actually connecting anything to anything, just an arch over the trail. and yet, there's a kind of whimsy to it almost. And you see that, later in Catholicism with so many beautiful things, but in a sense, useless things built. Why all these wayside chapels? Why all these little shrines and all over the place still? You think they don't have much utility, and yet you have to say that there's a kind of piquancy to them, a kind of beauty to them. They might have been built, many of them were, by a single family for a single purpose that's now been forgotten by the descendants, but there they are still, these little shrines. Yeah. So it's thinking about these things, what once was, what could still be. Doing a walk like this, for me, brought many thoughts to mind. I have to think that in Belloc, much the same when he did his much longer walk.
Yeah. Yeah, in a way, it's almost like the past is evangelizing the present. All these people who are going on these pilgrimage hikes without religious reasons, nevertheless pass through all these shrines. Who knows,
Yeah. Well, one of the things I hope to accomplish in my book about my walk is to bring to the American reader, that will be my chief audience, of course, some of this history, some of this culture that still exists, at least in ghost form, and can come back into, shall we say, bodily or material form at some point, if there are conversions of heart and mind and of culture. Because most Americans, as we all well know, are pretty much ignorant of Christian culture, history, even, of course, the history of their own country, let alone of any part of Europe. So I hope that maybe by inspiring people who don't have particular faith to go on a walk that just sounds interesting, they find themselves within what at least once was a Catholic culture, and by comparing my book to what they're seeing and experiencing, I hope that maybe that might induce them to say, there was something here, what was that? How can I learn more about it?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I wish you Godspeed on the book. It sounds like something we really need.
Well, I don't know how speedy it's going to be, so I'm not going to. All I can say at this point, since I haven't started to write it, I just got some notes from the trip. It's something to be worked on, but I'm making no promises as to when or even if I'll be able to finish it. But so it's a goal anyway, and so my reason to go on my journey was not as capricious as Belloc, but his book was the launching of a long literary career that it just covered so many areas. One of his books that he wrote not all that long after was called The Four Men, and it's a bit of a journey in the Sussex region of England, where he's got these four guys who are camping out together and talking around the campfire. The curious thing about the book, all four of them are Belloc, but each one represents a different facet of his personality. So there's, for example, there's the soldier, which he was. There's the poet. Belloc was a very good poet. Some people may be familiar with the poems that Chesterton wrote. Belloc wrote many more poems, and I think he was a much better poet, as good as Chesterton was in his own way. Many of the poems Belloc wrote, he actually put to music, and he sang. He'd sing these around the campfire or while walking and so on. So the book, The Four Men, is actually four aspects of his own personality talking and arguing with each other. It's a delightful approach. I mean, it's sort of, I guess you'd have to say, kind of schizophrenic approach to writing a book. But it works. And so he had a lot of interesting approaches to conveying information. And as I said earlier, he wasn't a formal scholar. He wasn't someone who loaded down his works with footnotes and so on. And yet, although he got some things wrong, in historical facts and so forth, biographical facts and the like, on the whole, even though he got some of the small facts wrong, his overall perception of the meaning of the people or events he talked about usually were spot on.
Yes. And, that brings up, for example, he's done a few books, such as the characters of the Reformation, characters of the Inquisition, where it's kind of little vignettes of the different movers and shakers. And, you almost feel like you know the person involved.
Yes. It's, for example, Etienne Gilson, the great Canadian Thomistic, Canadian-French Thomistic philosopher, said of Chesterton's similarly written biography of Thomas Aquinas. The book's called The Dumb Ox, which was Aquinas' nickname by his fellow friars. Gilson said it was the best written book biography of Aquinas it understood him better than any of the formal biographies did. And Chesterton's book had no footnotes either. I mean, it was just a kind of discussion on who this guy was.
Yeah.
So similarly, Chesterton's great friend Belloc wrote many historical or biographical vignettes. And so when you read them, you really get a sense of who these people were without having to wade through a lot of, born here, did this, that kind of stuff,
Right.
But you still come away saying, so that's who Cromwell was. So that's who Marie Antoinette was. So that's who Henry VIII was, all that kind of stuff. You get a good feel of that person's position in history.
Yes. Yeah, and that's so helpful, too, when you get to the scholarly works and you get to all the data, to get a feeling first for the person, and then the data makes sense.
Yeah, sometimes you can get the scholarly works and all this data, and you end up putting them down at the end, and you say, I don't really have a feel for the person.
Right.
If I were to meet him on the street, I know so much about him, but I know nothing. Okay.
Yeah.
Where
Right.
with Belloc, you sort of say, okay, I could sit down with this guy over a meal, and I know who he is, where he's coming from, and so on. It's just a different way of doing a biography, but a valid way, fair way to do it. So I highly recommend those books, such as Characters of the Reformation, and so on, that are still in reprint and can be found. I recommend that our listeners go to Amazon or elsewhere and just search on Hilaire Belloc. A lot of books will come up. They're still available. Most of them are fairly short. They're good reads. He was a very fine stylist. And, just pick up a few of them and go through, and you get a sense of him. But, of course, you get a sense of those he's writing about.
Yes. Yeah, very good. Boy, I can't believe that hour has just flown, Karl. Talk about great books and writings. How can our listeners get a hold of some of the books that you've written?
Well, I mentioned Amazon, of course. Go there and just search on my name, or go to my website, KarlKeating.com, where I talk about a fair number of my books. And take a look, and you might find something that you want to pick up in addition to Belloc.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Very good. Well, thank you so much for coming on the program.
Thanks for having me again, Gary.
All right. Well, ladies and gentlemen, Karl Keating. And, yeah, definitely do check out his website, KarlKeating.com. He's got lots of great stuff. He's got the classic books. He's got a bunch of very good new resources as well. Very helpful for defending the faith, and just fun stuff to read, too. Man, this flown. The whole hour has just gone away. Coming up tomorrow, we are going to have William Albrecht come back into the dojo. Today's the Feast of Ascension. I thought we'll have William on, and William's going to dig into the biblical and early church comments about the importance of the Ascension. So that's going to be a lot of fun, and William's always a great guest to have on. And coming up next, we have the show that started it all, the Terry and Jesse Show, the dynamic duo of Catholic Talk. And, man, it's time for me to turn off the dojo lights here and shut down the Midwest Command Center. I hope you had a lot of fun. It was a very interesting character, Hilaire Belloc, and it's just one of those jewels that we have of our faith that we can access to help us explain and defend the faith and help people know Jesus more and love him more. That's the goal, folks. God willing, talk to you tomorrow. Thank you. Have a great day. Bye.
In the 1990s, I lived and worked in Hollywood. But when my wife Betty's mom took ill, we relocated to Orange County. And it was during this time in our lives that I converted to Catholicism. Once my eyes were opened to the truth, I couldn't learn enough about the faith. But I had less free time than ever, especially with a long commute. That's when I discovered the real value of Catholic audio. Listening to cassette tapes transformed my daily commute into a miniature retreat. And that's the beauty of Virgin Most Powerful Radio today. Since the podcasts are archived, you can listen anytime on our smartphone app. I know how listening to Catholic audio can bring you closer to Christ and His Church. So I encourage you to visit the App Store or go to vmpr.org and download the app today. it just might change your life. I'm Matthew Arnold for Virgin Most Powerful Radio.